Embark on a journey of discovery with NK News and Koryo Tours as we proudly present the North Korea from a Distance tour, your window into the enigmatic world of the DPRK. With travel to North Korea remaining uncertain, our unique tour offers an unparalleled opportunity to explore the nation from its periphery. Designed for those who are keen to understand and observe North Korea, this tour is a comprehensive exploration of critical inter-Korean sites. Immerse yourself in a series of engaging tours along the border, interactive briefings and insightful Q&A sessions with leading specialists. Our tour is more than just sightseeing. It's an educational expedition that sharpens your perspective on the Korean peninsula. This is your chance to join a community of like-minded individuals, from academics to policy enthusiasts, all brought together by a shared interest in North Korean affairs. Visit NK News or contact Koryo Tours to secure your place now and gain a deeper insight into one of the most closely watched regions in the world. Don't wait, spaces are filling fast.
Podcast listeners, and welcome to the NK News podcast. I'm your host, Jacco Zwetsloot, and this interview was recorded on Wednesday, the 17th of July, 2024. And I'm joined via StreamYard from his home in England by Dr. Ed Pulford, who is an anthropologist and senior lecturer in Chinese studies at the University of Manchester. He has a new book, Past Progress, Time and Politics at the Borders of China, Russia and Korea, which we will discuss today. Welcome on the show, Ed.
Thanks very much, Jacco. It's great to appear.
Now, your book, as I said in the introduction, it's called Past Progress, Time and Politics at the Borders of China, Russia and Korea. Briefly, what's it about?
Well, I guess it's about how people from different countries, across borders, between countries, perceive their relationships with people on the other side of those borders in terms of time, in terms of whether the people and the place that they look at across the border, for example, the Tumen River border between China and North Korea, whether they perceive those people to be in the same sort of time space, if you like. Are those people behind us? Are they ahead of us? And I guess this is a very widely held view. It's very common when people travel to different countries, I think, for the perception to be that this place is more modern or more advanced or less modern or something than what might have been expected. But I guess in socialist countries such as North Korea, China, or the Soviet Union, there's a particular kind of intensity to how time has been part of identifying the state. And so everyday people, in my view, and based on the fieldwork that I conducted at this triple border, perceive the people from across the border in very stark ways to be from different periods of time. And that's all the more stark, I think, in the wake of the collapse of some of these socialist projects. I hope that's not too obscure a summary, but basically that's the theme. And I guess the core question I'm trying to answer in many ways is why it is that people are so taken, are so captured by this idea of progress, of forward movement, why it is that we understand our place in the world. And again, it's not just people on the North Korea-China border or anywhere else, but why it is that so many people in the world understand themselves to be somewhere in a forward-moving temporal frame.
Yeah, okay. Just on the most practical level, is there actually a time difference, a difference in time zones between the parts of Russia, China, and North Korea that meet?
Yes, although there's more complexity than one might expect to how people cross these borders and what time they end up adhering to. So the gap between that northeastern part of China and the adjacent part of Russia varies depending on daylight savings and so on, between 2 and 3 hours. So again, that's a big difference when crossing a single short distance across a border, a huge leap there, 2 or 3 hours. Between Korea and China, there's a 1 hour difference, I guess, these days, or you know, that's sort of the standard thing. But North Korea has, I think is probably well known to many listeners, played a little bit with its time zone, including actually, as it would happen during the period when I was conducting my research about 7 or 8 years ago, when there was a sort of half-hour shift in 2015 to apparently, according to reporting, move away from being on the same time zone as Japan.
Right.
But that then got cancelled, as far as I'm aware. However, one of the cases that I highlight in this book is Chinese tourists visiting North Korea. They don't bother with any kind of adherence to North Korean time, whatever difference or otherwise there might be between China and North Korea. They just continue to operate on Chinese time the whole time they're there. So I guess, whether or not there does exist a time is sort of immaterial to some people who are crossing the borders.
Right. And so we're talking for most of the time of your field work about this Chinese city called Hunchun, which is on that sort of three-way border crossing between China, Russia, and North Korea. Just give us a sense of what the borders between those three countries are like in that city of Hunchun. Is it simply just like in Europe when you go from the Netherlands to Belgium, you just cross a line and nobody pays any attention to it? Or are there border guards at all three nations? I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, well, these are very sort of firmly inscribed, firmly defended and reinforced borders, and have been for quite a long time. The North Korea-China border, I guess, has maybe in the longer term over many decades been a little bit more open than the one between China and Russia. But I think we've seen quite clearly in the last few years that more and more sort of reinforcement from both sides, actually resulting from a combination of concern over people leaving on the North Korean side and concern over people arriving on the Chinese side. That's led to a certain amount of reinforcement. The Tumen River at this point outside Hunchun, as you mentioned, it's very shallow, slow-flowing, low-key kind of border river. It's not, it's not.
So the river actually forms the border at that point. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, since the early 18th century, that's been the case. The Yalu on the west side and the Tumen on the right-hand side, right? Both of them originating on Paektusan, on Changbaishan, and that basically delineating the border more or less consistently since the 1710s. On the Russia side of things, that's a newer border. Mid 19th century was when Russia sort of annexed that part of land and brought its own territory all the way down to that triangular point, Hunchun, which I should say is in this Yanbian Korean Autonomous Prefecture in northeast China. Hunchun is the town at which point basically all three borders meet. And yeah, from the mid 19th century, the Russians basically concluded a treaty with the Qing dynasty, the Chinese government at the time. And that border, even after the sort of initial, conclusion of that treaty, there was quite a lot of movement to and fro for quite a significant period of time. But especially after the founding of the Soviet Union in 1922, once the Bolsheviks got there and sort of set up the Soviet state in this part of Russia, the border became more and more firmly reinforced and defended. There's no obvious geographical marker right there. There's a kind of ridge. There's no river. There's rivers on much of the rest of the Chinese border, actually, with Russia, further to the north, the River Ussuri and the River Amur. But here it's a kind of line drawn along a ridge that brings Russia all the way down to the point where it also borders Korea. Again, that point of crossing with that small Tumen River bridge that I guess became a little iconic during the pandemic when some Russian diplomats were leaving North Korea on a kind of hand-pushed, hand-pumped cart with all their bags. That's the point where Russia and North Korea join there. So you have quite distinct sort of the look of it is varied, but it's quite a wild area as well. I mean, the town of Hunchun is not very big. Not a huge number of people live like right up to the border, but there are villages on all three sides that are pretty close to the borders.
And is there a sort of a tourist magnet, a point where the three countries meet, where, like in some places, in some countries and in some US states, you'll find like there's a rock or a marker where people can stand around and hold hands, and one of them's in each country. Is that kind of a thing there as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you don't have things like, the world's biggest boot made out of cheese or whatever novelty things appear on the side of highways in the US to attract people. But maybe you don't need that, because actually the tourist site that you've alluded to there is a little way to south east of the town of Hunchun itself. If you drive down about, half an hour, 40 minutes or so from the actual town, you get to a place called Fangchuan. Pangchang, I guess is the name in Korean, and has a platform, a kind of tower that you can climb and overlook all three countries and see into that neighboring parts of Russia, across the Tumen into the neighboring parts of Korea. And I guess the big draw in many ways for tourists there too is that you can see the Sea of Japan, as it's called in China, or East Sea, I guess, for Koreans. Although I should say that actually Chinese Koreans call it Ilbon. They're not so bothered, it seems, by the nationalist claim to it not being the Sea of Japan that you get on the peninsula. But the sea over to the east is mostly visible if it's a clear day, but that's not accessible to China because Russia and North Korea come down and kind of cut China's access to the Sea of Japan there. So it's a nice view, and it's become an increasingly popular tourist destination on itineraries that will take you maybe to Paektusan, and then to some other major sites in the area, and then down to this little triple border point. It's worth a visit. Right. I would recommend it.
Okay. But it sounds like that triple border point, it's all on the Chinese side. So I'm guessing that you can't just sort of easily hop across the borders and say, now I'm in Russia, now I'm in North Korea, now I'm back in China again. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right, Jacco. Yeah, it's a very kind of interesting situation that in microcosm, in a very local setting, I guess, brings into focus the attitude that each country, each state has to its national borders. Because on the Chinese side, it's pretty free and easy. There's kind of raucous groups of tourists having a great time, getting right down there, and you can really go right up to the line and the border. You can see all kinds of artifacts of border drawing projects over the last couple of centuries. There's border stones with the Russian side, and also a kind of small museum about a battle that happened there, the Janggulfeng or Hassan battle that occurred there between a Japanese Imperial Army and the Soviet Army during the 30s. There's all manner of attractions that really push you right up to the line where the new country starts. On the Russian side, it's heavily militarized and basically zone of exclusion there. You can't freely enter that neighboring part of Russia unless you have a special permit. You have to be either a resident there or somebody with special permission to go to the town of Hassan, which is the adjacent town in Russia, because it's a sensitive area. It's the border with North Korea, with China, at the point at which North Korean work teams and so on cross into Russia. So there's no hint of any, tourism really, other than if you're able to organize a special trip to go and look at, I don't know, some lakes with some nice, birds and stuff in it. There's also no real infrastructure there for tourists, unlike in China. And then, of course, on the North Korean side, I guess you're looking across that Onsong County in Hamgyeongbuk-do. Well, I mean, I guess we're familiar with the tourist scene. Perhaps listeners to this podcast and people involved in its manufacture are familiar with how tourism to North Korea works. For local sort of tourists, I guess there is probably a small industry, I would imagine, in some trips up there, because there are a few local sites that aren't so far from that point. Things like Wangjaesan, the Wangjaesan Monument, which is a little bit to the west of there, where you can see, this great big statue of Kim Il-sung and his partisan fighters and so on. Yeah. And there's a museum also not so far. I guess Hyeonjin is not so far away. A museum to Kim Il-sung's mother, and so on. So there's kinds of bits and bobs on the North Korean side, and that are taken in sometimes by tours undertaken by foreigners as well. Yeah. But yeah, I think it's a very, very different kind of, environment on each side that really reflects whether or not those countries are confident in some respects about their borders, or, whether they feel like they want random people, whether domestic citizens or foreigners or anyone else, sort of wandering right up to the edge.
Well, coming back to China, because that's where you did your field work, and that was around, 2013 to 2015, right?
Roughly, yeah. I mean, I've repeat visited since then a number of times, but yeah, the kind of primary chunk of the research that went into this book is, obviously receding, as many other things do, into times past. But yeah, roughly around then, yeah.
So I've heard and I've read from various sources that the ability of foreigners to approach the border, that particular border that you're talking about in northeast China, but also other places along the China-North Korea border, that's not quite what it used to be. Perhaps particularly during the pandemic, but even afterwards, there are some border areas that foreigners are not allowed to go to, and you have to. I have a Korean friend who went there, who sort of pretended he was a local ethnic Korean Chinese person. But of course, that as soon as he was asked to show an ID, that all fell apart. So I think things might not be as they were when you were there.
I think that's true. I mean, I think the trend in that direction actually was already starting. It's interesting the case or the question as to whether the pandemic was a kind of major watershed in its own right. And I think in many areas, when it comes to wandering around China's borders and crossing them and so on, it did change things quite significantly. But actually, I think even before that, there was already some increasingly sort of careful regimentation, organization of how people were allowed to move around this space, even back in the mid-2010s, even going along the border, for example, between Hunchun and Tumen. So sort of to the west, you're basically, there is a road all the way along the bank of the River Tumen there, which buses go along and so on. There was increasing kind of monitoring of who was getting on those buses and so on, even back in the 2010s. And also when it came to that Fangchuan tourist site, there was also a sort of increasing regularization of tour groups and so on. I mean, in the earlier days, sort of, like I say, early 2010s and so on, and certainly any longer ago than that, you could really just go down there, yourself. You could get a taxi or some, private transport right up to the tower where you can go over and look at the different countries. But actually, already before pandemic, they were starting to try to collect people, put them, in a car park that was sort of back from the actual tourist site itself, and put them then on tour buses. That meant that they were on a more fixed itinerary, and with these kind of designated spots. Part of that, I think, was reacting to the numbers that were increasingly going there. But yes, I do accept and well, I've seen and heard and spoken to people that I still am in touch with in that area who have seen that there is more sort of concern over these things, and that itself is not unprecedented. I mean, it's not, it wouldn't be totally accurate to say that all of China's borders all the way around there are totally, up for grabs in terms of going up to the very edge. Far to the north of there, for example, there's a border point with Russia, where there's an island that was in dispute until the 2000s, which has settled. The dispute has been settled, and everyone agrees now which part of the island is Russia and which is China, in the middle of the river. But actually, non-Chinese citizens are not allowed onto the Chinese bit of that island. So it's not totally out of character or unprecedented to have. It's not a North Korea specific thing, although obviously North Korea presents certain particular challenges when it comes to how that border has been over many decades, back into the 90s and before that too.
Okay, so focusing on this large town or small city of Hunchun with about 230,000 people. It's in China, but you've got ethnic Koreans there, you've got some Russians across the border. What was it like doing field work, and which languages did you learn to and speak while you were there?
Yeah, well, I had a background already in both in Chinese and in Russian, and that was sort of where I came to it sort of from. But in preparation for the actual research in Hunchun, I did a year of Korean language at Yembien University in Yenji, the sort of capital is putting it a bit strongly, but the main center of the Yembien Korean prefecture in that part of China. So I joined a class of 30 or so local Chinese students and did a intensive year, basically their first year undergrad degree in Korean. So I was working on that while I was there, and I lived there with a local Chosunjok family in Hunchun once I started my fieldwork there properly. And I mean, it was a really incredibly interesting period of time, as I think you would probably imagine. I mean, the kind of combination of languages and cultures and so on there. I mean, it jumps right out at you from walking around the town of Hunchun itself, because it's in Yembien. All of the signs are in Korean already, as well as in Chinese, because obviously it's China. But in order to sort of cater to Russian people in the town, there's also a significant number of Russian signs, and basically almost every shop has all three languages, which it just, even in a very non-academic or serious way, it just looks great because it's three different scripts, and it's all sort of all butted up together. So and actually that in many respects reflects a kind of pattern of interaction that's going on there. There really is a significant presence of all three groups. There are local ethnic Koreans, i.e. Chinese citizen Chosunjok, who are, a significant proportion of the town. I mean, less and less. I guess this is the story across Yanbian over the last, now 30 plus years in terms of migration to South Korea. There was actually a news story at the very beginning of 2022, I think, which indicated that there are now more Chosunjok in South Korea than there are in Yanbian, which is a major sort of turning point. I guess some of those numbers are a bit hard to pin down because people are quite mobile and moving to and fro a lot. But anyway, there's still
and there's fluidity. People are coming back and forth. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So whether someone is actually fully in a place is another question. But the population there, is also significantly Han Chinese, also lots of Russians. And navigating between those different kind of groups of people, I found really interesting. And you kind of have the sense there.
What's the status of the Russians there? Do they have Chinese citizenship?
No, they're all visitors. No, they've all come across the border, temporarily, basically. There are some people who are there longer term, studying or working, and there are sort of Russian interests there that mean that it's not sort of completely temporary. But I guess it's more common for Russians to be there as temporary visitors for shopping or medical treatment or a whole bunch of other things, which they do on a kind of regular basis. So they're not sort of permanent residents or people who are all there all the time, but they often are very familiar with Hunchun and know it well because they come from just across the border in many cases, not very far away geographically, and they come in and spend a few days or a few weeks, depending on what they're doing, on a regular basis. So they get, they build up a lot of familiarity with the place and with the town. So there's, a kind of gradation there, I guess, of like temporary and permanent people or people who are residents. Local people are already from a variety of different ethnic groups. And then the outsiders that are there also includes, some Koreans from both Koreas and a real kind of patchwork.
Well, now, as you know, we here at NK News, we focus almost exclusively on North Korea. So why is doing field work in Hunchun useful for people who are interested in studying and understanding the DPRK or North Korea better?
Well, I think this is it's in some ways, a time-sensitive question, or one that has shifted over a period of time. I mean, certainly for quite a few decades or a couple of decades, especially from the 90s into 2000s, Yanbian was a place you could come as an outside researcher or someone interested in North Korea and really, encounter, get a much storied, rare glimpse of North Korean life, whether peering across the border or speaking to local experts in institutions in the Yanbian who had a kind of depth of engagement with North Korea that was really unmatched, including even in South Korea at that point, because actually people were able to freely move to and fro, or freely-ish. There was a lot of contact, right up until the 90s, and Chosunjok going to North Korea was a very, very common thing. So I guess you could, get a kind of, understanding of society and of how things work there in that period that was, deeper really than many other places you might go for that, and in the absence of the ability to do, immersive kind of fieldwork or research or surveys or anything like that within North Korea. But I think the other thing that the Yanbian is sort of a fascinating case for is as a sort of meeting point. It sometimes gets referred to as this sort of third Korea, but it's also somewhere that, combines North and South in quite interesting ways. The course I studied on in Yanbian University, for example, was called Chosunmal. The degree is referred to in that way, but the course texts that we had referred to Korean as Hangulgo, as Hangulyu. So there was this kind of odd mix, and that book, that textbook, was authored, for example, by or produced by a publishing company actually way up north in Hyeonjin, where there's another community of Chosunjok, not the Yanbian ones, but a different group of Chinese Koreans. So actually, the texts in that book combined this local Korean satori, there's the local Korean speech, kind of, elements of that were still, I guess, more formal, and certain kinds of expressions that might sound a bit awkward or weird in South Korea, but with lots of, South Korean influence. And that's something that has, only intensified. I guess, Yanbian in some ways is the first place that gets the Korean wave, because it's outside Korea, but it's open to all kinds of Korean cultural influence, and it's completely Korean speaking, or in many cases Korean speaking. So there is a kind of amazing combination there of South and North. So I guess in that sense, it helps you to sort of tease out what might be similar or different about those sorts of influences. But I think mainly that the thing that I mentioned there at the beginning, where you've got a large population of Koreans there who, have a much more sort of nuanced and complex view of North Korea as their immediate neighbors,
Right.
and people that they had a lot to do with until comparatively recently. That's a pretty unique situation vis-a-vis, North Korea related research.
Now, I've read that through the decades, there have been times when, relatively speaking, North Korea was an easier place to live in. So some people from China crossed over the border to live in North Korea. And then since at least the 1990s, it's been the other way, with North Koreans leaving to spend time in China. Did you talk about these phenomena with your informants in Yanbian?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, actually, I think I probably learned about that situation from people I spoke to there in a way that I hadn't previously appreciated. But the kind of position of those of Chosunjok within China, has shifted considerably over time with political shifts that have gone on in China, and that has coloured their attitude towards North Korea as a sort of alternative or as a sort of other place that they might feel historically connected to. I mean, in terms of the actual origins of that community, many of them do have some sort of family history not so far away, just in what was Hamgyongdo before it got divided into north and south. Although there's also a significant proportion of Yanbian Koreans who come from Gyeongsando and places like further south, actually, in what is now the south. But I guess in terms of how much attachment or otherwise they felt to either place, well, in the early days of the PRC, the 50s, North Korea, the Chosunjok were celebrated as kind of key socialist fighters against Japanese imperialism, people who helped to bring communist power to the Northeast. So they had a high status and were really allowed to govern their own affairs quite happily in Yanbian from the 50s onwards, and really a unique situation among minorities in China. From the 60s, however, or mid-60s, and the Cultural Revolution, there was a strong xenophobic kind of anti-minority, anti-borderland feeling across China, and North Koreans at that point were Chinese Koreans at that point were sort of stigmatized and attacked in a way that was common to lots of borderlanders. At that point in time, North Korea had developed quite rapidly, after the Korean War, this Japanese industrial legacy and various other benefits that I guess were there, quite organized Soviet-style economy. And so compared to China's chaotic Cultural Revolution, North Korea at that point seemed maybe an attractive alternative to those Chinese Koreans who, in not many cases, it would be an exaggeration to say it was huge numbers, but significant numbers, and people who were relatives or people who the people I spoke to knew and were related to did move over the border there. However, as you mentioned, tides turn again, and as things get worse in North Korea, China, as it sort of takes off economically from the 80s and 90s, starts to seem a more appealing option, especially in the wake of economic collapse and the kind of command economy kind of coming up short once the Soviet Union is no more in the early 90s. And so, yeah, of course, we're familiar, I think, or many people will be, with the North Korean famine into the early 2000s. And that occasioned a huge number of people, again, moving back in the other direction too. So there's been an enormous amount of sort of to and fro. And I guess, in terms to bring it right up to the present, I mean, what's most interesting to me and that relates to the previous answer or the question about what can we learn about North Korea there, it's that actually this push-pull and some of the division, some of the increasing and reinforcement of borders and so on over the last 10 or 20 years has meant that, oddly enough, these Chinese Koreans and people living in this area now look at North Korea in a way that's oddly similar to how a lot of the rest of the world views it, as a kind of odd, far away place, even though you can literally see it from the center of town in Hunchun. You can see hills that are just over there, but they're in North Korea. But despite that proximity, despite decades or centuries of ethnic mixing and commonality language-wise and so on, actually people increasingly look at it as this sort of mysterious, odd place. And that is a real reflection, I think, of, a kind of estrangement that has been produced by, again, some of these historical forces between the two countries.
And there's also a much smaller group of ethnic Han Chinese who have lived in North Korea, called the Hwagyo, who presumably have the ability to cross borders as well. I think they numbered now somewhere between 5,000 to 10,000. Were you able to meet any of them during your time in Northeast China?
No, I haven't come across them there. I think I did bump into some in the lift at one point in a hotel in Pyongyang, or came across people with that background, because they kind of do seem to live an interesting kind of middle in between life in
Yes.
that context. But no, I didn't come across Hagyo in northeast China. I would imagine that their most natural points of call in China itself are probably a bit more mainstream, because if they're engaged in China-related stuff, I guess there's no reason for them in particular to go to Yanbian, because there isn't that kind of ethnic connection, because they're Han Chinese. Right. Well, I would imagine that the North Koreans that are in Yanbian are, I guess, just a larger number of the kind of groups that you see elsewhere in China: business people, dance and song troupes, and people, involved in those kinds of business, quite significant numbers. People studying, of course, at Yanbian University and so on. But that's, those people are often in other parts of China too, just more in Yanbian.
So you were actually able to come into unmediated contact with North Korean citizens in Yanbian?
Yeah, to an extent. There was a hotel that I used to visit quite often, made friends with someone who worked there who was a Russian-speaking Han Chinese person who was, I think that their parents ran the hotel. And, I was a sort of honorary Russian for a lot of the time there. These days, maybe it would be a mixed blessing. But in any case, it was it was a sort of, I was just sort of assumed to be Russian much of the time. And so some of the friends I made among kind of local Chinese people were often kind of through some sort of Russia-related connection. And this friend of mine there, that hotel had a resident Korean dance troupe who played there, and who they'd sort of hang out in the bar and or the restaurant in the hotel. And so yeah, got some some level of chatting to them. Again, I'm my sort of whatever anthropological or research-based instincts, you slightly try to moderate your desperate desire to delve into the ins and outs of someone's deep subjectivity when they're in a situation that, of course, is probably not going to be, it's not so easy for them to interact with some random English person, or indeed some random Russian person, if that's what I was assumed to be. So yeah, I don't want to over egg my incredible insights into life for those people, but I did, I got to know people well enough, and that definitely fed into my my research and how I understood the relationships that across those borders.
Now, from their founding and through their history, both the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and the People's Republic of China, while both being notionally or at least nominally socialist countries, they've trod different paths, different versions of how to achieve socialism, that socialist utopia that they're both dreaming of. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that is that sort of returns us actually to this kind of core interest I have in this book, in how projects which have in common this allegiance to socialism, as you've said, and therefore to a kind of shared trajectory towards this utopian idea somewhere in the future, also diverge and also basically are constructed and carried out within kind of national containers, like within the borders of those states. This, I guess, in my understanding and in my sort of some of what I write in the book is partly a function of there being projects that have a inheritance back to this Stalinist idea of socialism in one country, the idea that socialism after Lenin and Stalin actually was no longer this borderless utopian idea that everyone or working people across the world would unite regardless of ethnic or national affiliation and so on. There was this sort of pragmatic, I guess, project, and in the Stalin case ended up being a very, of course, a brutal and harsh authoritarian project to construct a socialist system within the borders of a country. And I guess, Chinese and Korean incarnations of that are, in some respects have a sort of formal resemblance to that in the sense that they are one country socialism for China and for North Korea. Now, slightly different, I guess, from the Soviet Union, or at least in a different way. Each project is also very concerned with national liberation and post-colonial or post-imperial, project of getting out of that kind of domination by either Japan and of course earlier and, well, at the same time, European Western colonists. So I guess that's something that in broad terms is shared. But the distinction, for example, between how to construct this socialist project in a massive post-imperial space like China, where you have dozens of different ethnic groups, languages, all kinds of different ways of doing things, what Marx or Marxist thinking would think of as different modes of production, different peoples considered according to this progressive view of history who are thought of being on different stages of some sort of historical trajectory towards a socialist or communist utopia, versus the North Korean case, which certainly a huge amount of effort has been put into constructing that as a mono-ethnic, monocultural, broadly state. Those are quite distinct kinds of projects. And I think the Chosunjok, because they sort of straddle this case, they are in some ways attached to and implicated in the North Korean socialist project, which is this powerfully mono-ethnic, largely focused on Japanese colonialism project, and the Chinese one, which is by virtue of China's sort of status as a multi-ethnic ex-empire, they're part of this other thing, which is a much more kind of plural and complicated thing. I think they act as a great sort of bellwether or case study for trying to see, what it means, including what it means to be Korean and socialist over time in quite different national contexts. So that's a sort of angle that I'm interested in here. And there's a Soviet-Russian angle to that too, although perhaps less immediately germane to the NK News podcast.
Indeed. So when the Chosunjok, when the ethnic Koreans in Hunchun look over the river at North Korea and they're thinking about progress and socialism and backwardness, what are their thoughts? How do they describe North Korea to you? What they're seeing?
Yeah, it's an interesting mix of things, I think, because it won't come as a surprise to anyone who's familiar with China today that younger people in this region are not sort of dyed-in-the-wool ardent socialists per se. I think they don't necessarily take seriously a lot of the official Chinese government messaging and the idea that this is somehow a socialist project in some kind of very doctrinaire, archetypal way from past decades. But
although there is still a utility in joining the Chinese Communist Party and being part of those structures, isn't there?
There absolutely is, yeah. And in some senses, that speaks to the kind of national character of the Chinese Socialist project. I think that, actually the incredible structural complexity of this sort of still somewhat Stalinist 1950s model of socialist statism overlaid on a Chinese already complex, hierarchical society, that's still all the iconography or the language around that. And Xi Jinping has been someone who's, doubled down on socialism, communism, Marx, Engels, blah, blah, blah. He talks about it all the time. But in terms of what, quote unquote, real or what socialism actually is aiming for, maybe that's a bit less a concern of many people. But I think the relationship with North Korea is still seen as a sort of one mediated through this shared socialist past and different fates since that project sort of started to change in the 90s. And so certainly older people, including the granny and the family that I lived with in Hunchun, still think of, actually people of that generation still do largely think of China as a sort of socialist place in contradistinction to Western capitalist places, and kind of look on North Korea positively as a sort of still as a what's called in Chinese a 兄弟国家, like a brother, socialist brother country. And so there is a kind of still alive, that kind of nostalgia, but they also look at it as a place that has, that is backwards, that has sort of failed to change its socialist model, and that in some ways reflects on people's sort of the Koreans their kind of innate character somehow. They just haven't seemed to get it together. The other, just as a slight aside, the other really interesting thing that I heard quite often in how people describe North Korea was using a term "fengjian," which means feudal. Like they would often sort of categorize North Korea as a feudal country, which is odd. It's maybe not totally wrong given the sort of power structures and so on that are so obvious in North Korea. But fengjian itself as a term came about, especially during the Mao era, as a way to talk about that imperial past that socialism was supposed to help China escape. So the idea that this place that has been supposedly doing socialism for 70, 80 years is now more fengjian, more feudal than China is also a kind of curious mix. And so this sort of language, it's really embedded in people's cross-border perceptions. And again, this comes back to the sort of overarching theme of what I'm interested in, how people look at those relationships in terms of the language, the iconography, the kind of frames of analysis that people have. These aren't academics, they're just regular people, but they still sort of have this socialist inflected way of perceiving things, not to make them seem like some kind of totally other, impossible to understand group of people, but it plays a role in people's lives, unsurprisingly.
Yes. Now, since the personal is political, how does the proximity of the people of Yanbian and particularly in Hunchun to the DPRK influence how they think about the DPRK and its international relations in an everyday way?
Yeah, well, that element too is I think quite interesting. I mean, again, I think there's an element of generational distinction here among Yanbian Koreans in how they would sort of look on North Korea's global orientation. Although, I think in a kind of much more recent frame of the last few years and increasing tensions with China and the United States, or a kind of broader understanding that there might be greater sense of stress and division between China and other countries. I think there's a kind of admiration, not to put it too strongly, but a kind of, people are sort of impressed at North Korea's incredible stubbornness, if you like, in that sense. I mean, there's definitely people who are like, look at that those guys are really doing something serious. We might not agree with it, but you've got to hand it to them. They are, in a way, really doubling down on their whole project to resist anything of that nature. But I think, the kind of still now the idea that people, can cross borders, and of course, as we mentioned earlier, going to South Korea and elsewhere in the world has been a very important part of Joseonjuk lives now for 30 years or more. And so that idea that openness, kind of mobility, and a kind of connectedness to other places, is a significant feature of how Joseonjuk understand themselves and understand their society. So again, to look at North Korea through that lens, that people feel great sympathy with Koreans there, as in some ways people that they might feel nostalgic about from a sort of co-ethnic or kind of sense of shared history perspective. But the idea that those people are a bit trapped, I think, is also a factor in how they look at North Korea. So it's a kind of a mix there of some sort of reluctant admiration, and then a kind of sympathy, along with a bunch of other things, including, as I mentioned earlier, a sort of confusion as to why don't those guys just reform their economy like we did and sort themselves out.
It sounds like that also goes some way to explaining the enduring popularity of North Korean restaurants in China.
Yeah, I think there's a booming industry and a lot of this sort of nostalgic stuff. I mean, those North Korean restaurants and the kind of performances that you can enjoy there, as you eat your raengmyeon or whatever, the coding of that and the kind of aesthetics of it are very familiar. They feel adjacent to a lot of the Cultural Revolution era songs and dances and so on that, again, older generations within China sort of still appreciate and feel a nostalgia for, whether it's actually because of socialism or any kind of actual connection to the political project, or whether it's, just a sort of more generic nostalgia for simpler times, or whether it's a personal nostalgia for people's youths. People are nostalgic for their youth, whether it was living, I don't know, in a I mean, as we witness in the UK, whether people who prefer to think of their youth as being in some sort of simpler, easier UK to live in, or whether they were living in Maoist China. They kind of, it almost doesn't matter. I think people are quite naturally inclined to be nostalgic. So those restaurants, I think, cater to a variety of both sorts of ideologically flavored things and just general. And now for a younger generation, as I said, who look on North Korea as increasingly mysterious and weird and sort of exotic in an odd way, there's something a bit sort of, edgy about going to this place and like what are they doing? It's just so nuts. So I think they've got a market there for in a variety of different reasons.
Now, when were you last in Hunchun or in Yanbian?
I haven't been since the pandemic, actually. Sadly, I've only been to China once since the pandemic at all. So 2019, I guess, was the last time.
I imagine you might still have ongoing contact with people who live there today, even though you haven't been there yourself.
Yeah, I'm still in touch periodically with people from different sort of backgrounds and different I guess in different walks of life there, and in a sense, the border effects of the pandemic, were very, very harshly felt by people there who, previously were relying on tourist business, for example, that obviously completely dried up, or were, involved in cross-border trade. All the Russians that lived there basically had to go, and Chinese people involved in border trade with Russia, or to a sort of slightly lesser extent, but also things in like seafood to North Korea and other sorts of things. They really struggled and had to find other things to do, kind of batten down the hatches and grit their teeth through that period. So I think from what I've learned, things are kind of starting cautiously to resume their former tempo, at least vis-a-vis the Russian side of things. But as I think we've already discussed, and you've brought it up a number of times on the pod, I think, when will people be allowed to come and go? And of course, Russia, China are likely to be the first places that, and already are a bit, places that people can go to from into North Korea from. I think still there's some caution and some slowness about reopening to some of that cross-border trade across the Tumen.
Yes, it's interesting that even though we've seen over the last 6 months various Russian tourist groups going to North Korea, apparently the full spigot on letting Chinese tourists back into North Korea hasn't been turned on yet.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I guess partly that may be a function of managing scale. I think there were never that many Russians. There was always a flow and going out to Wonsan to go to the beach, or even around Hyeonjin, or these various places. There's kind of, I guess, a sort of trial element to that. But I think it's not to kind of try to take cases of tourism to analyze much more complicated, intricate diplomatic things, but sort of classic vein of playing China and Russia, or China and the Soviet Union, off against each other a little bit. I suppose now, as we've witnessed over the last few weeks, Russia is somewhere that North Korea is quite happy to be buddying up with at the moment, and why not give it a go? This stuff has played out and been evident around the border as well for decades. Right back to the 70s and the 80s, when Kim Il Sung was sort of navigating his way between the two communist superpowers. So maybe it's not so unexpected to find that it reflects itself in tourism as well today.
Yeah, it is. It's fascinating to watch, and I could certainly understand the interest for you and why you picked that area to do your field research. That brings us to the end of our interview today. I'd like to recommend to listeners, if they're interested in knowing more, to check out your book, Past Progress: Time and Politics at the Borders of China, Russia, and Korea. Are you on Twitter?
No, not in any kind of overt or active way. I sometimes look at it, and I usually regret it.
All right. Yeah, no, I understand. I've more or less gone inactive on it myself, but we will include a link to your page at the University of Manchester in the show notes so people can find you. So thanks once again for coming on the show, Ed Pulford.
Thanks very much, Jacco. I really enjoyed speaking to you.
Keeping up with South Korea's fast-paced developments just got easier. Welcome to the Korea Pro podcast, your weekly briefing on the stories that matter. Hosts Jongmin Kim and John Lee dissect topics from diplomacy to technology, ensuring you're always informed. Our episodes are a must for professionals in and out of Seoul. Subscribe on your preferred platform and elevate your understanding of Korean affairs. Korea Pro podcast, where clarity meets depth. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our podcast episode for today. Our thanks go to Brian Betts and Alana Hill for facilitating this episode, and to our post-recording producer genius Gabby Magnuson, who cuts out all the extraneous noises, awkward silences, bodily functions, and fixes the audio levels. Thank you, and listen again next time.